Education was a weapon, a shield, and a doorway.
But to understand why a grandmother would sit on a porch in Macon, Mississippi, and tell you to learn to read and teach someone else to read, go to school and keep learning. Because there was a time in this country when learning to read was not just discouraged, it was illegal. Enslaved people were punished for it, beaten for it, sometimes killed for it, because reading meant something dangerous. It meant awareness. It meant the ability to question. It meant understanding what was written and what was being hidden. And when freedom finally came, people didn't wait. They didn't hesitate. They didn't ask permission. They built schools out of nothing. Church basements became classrooms. Porches became places of instruction. Parents who could not read themselves made sure their children would, because they understood something clearly. If we don't learn, don't look back. You're doing the right thing, not in chains, but in condition. That is what your grandmother was protecting you from. Not just struggle, but repetition. The same limitations, the same walls, the same silence. So when families left places like Macon and made their way to cities like Chicago, they didn't just carry clothes, they carried lessons. They carried discipline. They carried expectation. And in those crowded apartments, in those unfamiliar school systems, in those moments where everything felt new, one thing remained the same. Learn, no matter what. Learn anyway. Because education was not comfort, it was defense, it was identity, it was survival. And before we continue, if stories like this matter to you, stories about survival, memory, family, and the lessons our communities carried forward, I hope you'll subscribe to From Chains to Change, because there are still so many stories people were never taught. And together we're bringing them back into the light. Thou shalt teach another. Knowledge is our first taste of freedom and our daily bread. But the road did not end in Mississippi. When families left places like Macon, they did not leave empty-handed. Even when they had very little money, even when they carried only bags, memories, names, and warnings, they carried something no one could easily take away. They carried what they had learned. They carried the commandment, learn to read, teach another, keep going. So, when the road turned north, when the train tracks stretched towards cities like Memphis, Chicago, and Detroit, the lesson traveled with them. It sat beside them in crowded train cars. It moved into small apartments. It followed them into factories, schools, churches, and neighborhoods where nobody knew their story. Because the city was not the same as the South. But the need to understand did not disappear. There were new papers to read, new rules to learn, new systems to navigate, rental agreements, job applications, school notices, military forms, welfare forms, medical forms, court papers. Every page could carry a promise, a trap, or a closed door. And if you could not read it, somebody else could define your life for you. That is why the commandment followed them north, because freedom was not just crossing a state line. Freedom was knowing what was written in front of you, knowing when something was being hidden, knowing how to ask the next question, and knowing enough to teach the next child before the world got to them first. Some families arrived in Chicago believing education alone would protect them. They had escaped the open terror of the South, the humiliation of Jim Crow signs, the constant fear of saying the wrong thing to the wrong person. They believed the North would finally allow them to breathe. And in some ways, it did. There were factory jobs, streetcars, tall buildings, bigger schools, libraries filled with books their grandparents could have been punished for touching. But the North had its own invisible borders. Certain neighborhoods welcomed black labor, but resisted black ownership. Families discovered that even with hard work, some doors quietly stayed closed. Banks drew lines around communities. Realtors redirected black families into overcrowded neighborhoods. Schools received different resources. Opportunity existed, but so did barriers hidden behind paperwork, contracts, maps, and policies many Southern families had never seen before. And that is why the commandments still mattered. Learn to read. Read the contract. Read the lease. Read the application. Read the law. Because survival was no longer just about escaping violence in the street. Now survival could depend on understanding the fine print sitting quietly on a desk. The system had changed its language, but it had not stopped testing whether black families understood the rules. That is why parents kept repeating the lesson to their children, even far from Mississippi. Go to school, ask questions, pay attention, and never let somebody else define your future because you could not read what was written in front of you. And even with education, many black families still carried exhaustion that could not be measured on paper. Parents worked long shifts in factories, hospitals, rail yards, kitchens, and warehouses, then came home to help children with homework late into the night. Some mothers cleaned office buildings they would never be hired to work inside during the day. Some fathers repaired machines in factories while quietly hoping their children would never have to stand in the same place they did. Education became more than reading books. It became an attempt to break cycles. A mother teaching spelling at the kitchen table was not just helping with homework, she was fighting history. A father asking about grades after a 12-hour shift was trying to push his child beyond the limits placed on him. Even grandparents who never finished school themselves carried deep respect for learning because they understood exactly what had once been denied. And still, the pressure remained. Children learned to move carefully between two worlds. One world told them to dream bigger. Another reminded them every day that race still shaped opportunity. Some students were encouraged. Others were underestimated before they even spoke. Some classrooms opened doors. Others quietly lowered expectations. But the commandment survived all of it. Learn to read. Learn the system. Teach another. Keep going. Because every generation hoped the next generation might walk through doors that had once been locked shut. And somewhere in that long journey from Mississippi porches to crowded northern apartments, from church benches to school hallways, black families built a tradition stronger than fear itself, the belief that knowledge could carry a child farther than suffering ever could. That belief survived migration. It survived crowded neighborhoods, factory smoke, underfunded schools, and the quiet humiliation of constantly having to prove your worth in rooms where people had already made assumptions about you before you even spoke. Because education was never just about making money. It was about dignity. It was about understanding the world well enough to move through it without being completely trapped by it. For many families, School became sacred territory. Report cards mattered, reading mattered, speaking properly mattered. Parents corrected grammar at dinner tables. Grandmothers asked about homework before asking about anything else. Some children did not understand the pressure at the time. They only felt expectations sitting heavily on their shoulders, but those expectations came from somewhere. They came from generations who remembered what it meant to live without choices. And even when families struggled financially, even when rent was late, lights were cut off, or jobs disappeared, many still protected one thing fiercely: the idea that the next child might go farther, might understand more, might finally step into opportunities their parents were never allowed to reach. That hope became part of the culture itself, not because Black families believed education solved everything, but because they understood what could happen without it. Without reading, somebody else could explain the lease. Somebody else could explain the loan. Somebody else could explain the law. Somebody else could decide what your child was capable of before that child ever had a chance to prove them wrong. That is why school mattered so deeply. Not because every school was fair, not because every teacher believed in Black children, not because education erased racism. It did not. But learning gave people language. It gave them tools. It gave them a way to question what had been handed to them, a way to read the paper, challenge the rule, understand the form, and recognize when a door was being closed quietly. This is why commandment number 1 had to come first. Learn to read. Teach another. Knowledge is your first taste of freedom, because before you can fight for land, organize for justice, build a business, protect your family, or tell your own story, you have to understand the world trying to control you. That was the lesson carried from Macon to Chicago, from porches to classrooms, from grandparents to children. It was never just about school. It was about refusing to be made helpless. Not because Black families believed education could solve every problem overnight, but because they understood what ignorance had cost them for generations. In Mississippi, people could lose land because they could not read contracts. Families could be cheated by paperwork, trapped by laws they never had the chance to study, silenced in courtrooms where nobody explained their rights. Even freedom itself could be delayed by illiteracy. So parents carried a different kind of urgency. Read the signs, read the laws, read the ballot, read the fine print, because survival had changed forms. The whip was no longer the only weapon. Sometimes the weapon became confusion. Sometimes it became policy. Sometimes it became red lines drawn across neighborhoods where Black families were told they could not live. And still, the commandment survived. Learn to read. Teach another. From Mississippi to Chicago, children sat in crowded apartments, while mothers worked late shifts, and fathers carried exhaustion home from factories, rail yards, and warehouses. Yet somehow there was always a reminder waiting at the kitchen table. Finish your homework. Stay in school. Keep learning. Because generations who had once been forbidden to read now believed education was one of the few things nobody could permanently steal once it lived inside your mind. And that belief traveled forward like inheritance itself. Every diploma represented more than achievement. It represented distance traveled from a past where reading itself had once been treated like rebellion. And somewhere inside all of it, the old commandment kept moving forward through the generations. Learn to read, go to school, teach another, and do not look back. But even with education, many black families still found themselves walking a narrow road between progress and pressure. Children were often taught they had to work twice as hard just to receive half the recognition. Parents pushed discipline because they feared what could happen if their children made mistakes in systems that were never fully designed to protect them. For some families, education became the center of the household. Report cards were treated seriously. Teachers were respected. Homework came before play. Some children understood the reason for that pressure. Others only understood it years later. Because behind those expectations lived memory. Memory of grandparents who were denied schooling altogether. Memory of fathers who worked exhausting jobs but still studied at night trying to earn a GED. Memory of mothers who cleaned buildings, cooked meals, raised children, and still believed the next generation might finally step beyond survival and into real opportunity. And yet, opportunity still came with conditions. A black child could graduate with honors and still enter a world shaped by suspicion, unequal schools, restricted neighborhoods, hiring discrimination, and systems quietly designed to slow progress down without ever saying so openly. That was one of the hardest truths many families discovered after leaving the South. The signs were gone. But the barriers had learned how to hide themselves better. Sometimes discrimination appeared through school district lines, sometimes through hiring practices, sometimes through banks, housing policies, or the quiet lowering of expectations inside classrooms and workplaces where black excellence was often treated like surprise instead of potential. And because of that, the commandment had to grow stronger with every generation. Learn to read. Learn the system. Learn the history behind the system. Because understanding words on a page was no longer enough by itself. Families also had to understand the structures shaping everyday life around them. Why some neighborhoods received investment while others were ignored. Why some schools had newer books while others struggled. Why some families could build wealth across generations while others remained trapped, trying to recover from losses that began long before they were born. These were not easy conversations, but they became part of survival too, and still, many parents kept repeating the same lessons passed down from Mississippi porches and church benches. Pay attention. Ask questions. Do not let ignorance become a weapon used against you. Every generation hoped the next one would walk a little farther than they did. And through all the struggle, one belief continued traveling forward like inheritance itself. Knowledge could still open doors. Fear was trying to keep shut. That belief survived crowded apartments, long factory shifts, segregated schools, military service, layoffs, and economic pressure that often followed black families, no matter how far north they traveled. Even when parents were exhausted, many still sat at kitchen tables asking about homework. Grandmothers still corrected spelling words. Fathers still repeated the same warnings about paying attention, staying alert, and understanding how quickly opportunity could disappear if a person stopped learning. Many of them had already seen what happened when people were denied information. They had seen land disappear through paperwork. They had seen promises broken through contracts nobody fully explained. They had seen young people pushed toward labor, while others were encouraged toward leadership. So education became more than ambition. It became protection. Protection against confusion. Protection against manipulation. Protection against being told your place in the world before you had the chance to decide it for yourself. And somewhere inside those lessons, another commandment quietly began connecting itself to the first. Tell the story truthfully. If the next generation did not understand what earlier generations survived, they might mistake survival wisdom for fear, strictness, or overprotection. But the elders remembered. They remembered exactly why the lesson had to continue. Too many stories had already been buried. Too many children grew up learning dates without understanding what their own families had survived to reach those dates. Too many communities carried history quietly inside kitchens, church pews, porches, and family reunions, while the larger world moved forward as if those sacrifices had never happened. That is why storytelling became survival too. It was not storytelling for entertainment. It was storytelling for memory, for warning, for protection. Elders understood something many younger generations would only realize much later. If a people lose their story, they can lose their direction. And in many Black families, history was not always spoken loudly. Sometimes it appeared through small phrases repeated over and over again. Pay attention. Stay ready. Learn all you can. Don't let anybody take advantage of you. Those words carried generations inside them. Some children thought their parents were simply strict. Some believed grandparents worried too much. But behind those lessons lived memories of segregation, migration, discrimination, lost opportunities, and survival strategies built under pressure. That is why the commandments connected together. Learn to read, teach another, tell the story truthfully. Knowledge without memory can still leave a people vulnerable. And somewhere between Mississippi porches and northern city streets, Black families kept trying to hand the next generation more than survival. They were trying to hand them understanding. That understanding did not always come from textbooks. Sometimes it came from stories told late at night at kitchen tables after long shifts at work. Sometimes it came from grandmothers sitting quietly on porches, remembering things children were considered too young to fully understand. Sometimes it came through church testimonies, old photographs, funeral gatherings, or warnings repeated so many times they almost sounded ordinary. Those stories carried instruction inside them. They explained how families survived segregation without always saying the word segregation. They explained caution without describing every danger directly. They taught children how to move through a world that could become unfair very quickly, depending on where you stood, what you looked like, or who held power around you. That is why storytelling became another commandment. Memory could protect people too. A child who understood history could recognize patterns. A family that remembered what had happened before could prepare differently for what might come next. Stories became a bridge between generations, carrying lessons farther than laws or school books ever could by themselves. In many Black households, those lessons were treated seriously because elders understood how quickly history could disappear once people stopped talking about it. That is part of the reason these stories still matter now. The goal is not to remain trapped in the past. The goal is to understand how the past continued, shaping the present long after people believed those struggles were over. That understanding did not always come from textbooks. Sometimes it came from stories told late at night at kitchen tables after long shifts at work. Sometimes it came from grandmothers sitting quietly on porches, remembering things children were considered too young to fully understand. Sometimes it came through church testimonies, old photographs, funeral gatherings, or warnings repeated so many times they almost sounded ordinary. Those stories carried instruction inside them. They explained how families survived segregation without always saying the word segregation. They explained caution without describing every danger directly. They taught children how to move through a world that could become unfair very quickly, depending on where you stood, what you looked like, or who held power around you. That is why storytelling became another commandment. Memory could protect people too. A child who understood history could recognize patterns. A family that remembered what had happened before could prepare differently for what might come next. Stories became a bridge between generations, carrying lessons farther than laws or school books ever could by themselves. In many Black households, those lessons were treated seriously because elders understood how quickly history could disappear once people stopped talking about it. That is part of the reason these stories still matter now. The goal is not to remain trapped in the past. The goal is to understand how the past continued, shaping the present long after people believed those struggles were over. That is why commandment number 1 was never just about school. It was about survival inside a world that kept changing its face, but not always its intentions. It was about making sure the next child could read what others hoped would stay hidden. It was about giving the next generation more than fear, more than caution, more than endurance. It was about giving them tools. And in my own family, that commandment did not feel abstract. It sounded like my father telling me to learn to read, go to school, and not look back. It sounded like elders who may not have had every opportunity themselves, still believing the next child could go farther. It sounded like pressure at times, yes, but it was also protection. It was love, trying to prepare somebody for a world that was not always fair. That is why I keep coming back to these stories. Because what sounded like simple advice was carrying generations inside it. What sounded like discipline was sometimes memory speaking. What sounded ordinary was often survival wisdom passed down in the only language many families had. That is why these commandments were never only about the past. They were carried forward because the conditions kept changing, but the need for wisdom did not. One generation learned to survive open danger. The next had to survive hidden barriers. One generation learned to read in secret. Another had to read contracts, policies, school boundaries, and quiet exclusions that did not announce themselves with signs but still shaped a family's future all the same. And through all of it, Black families kept teaching, not always perfectly, not always gently, but urgently, because they knew what it meant to enter a world unprepared. They knew what it meant to trust systems that had never fully earned that trust. They knew what it meant to lose land, lose opportunity, lose years, and sometimes lose direction, because somebody else held the knowledge and never intended to share it fairly. So, when elders repeated themselves, when they pressed children about school, when they corrected grammar, when they asked if homework was finished, when they warned young people to pay attention, they were doing more than parenting. They were passing down strategy. They were saying, I may not be able to give you wealth. I may not be able to give you protection from everything. But I can give you something nobody should be able to take from you once it is yours. Understanding. That was the deeper meaning behind the pressure, behind the repetition, behind the commandment itself. Learn to read, teach another, tell the story truthfully, and carry forward what earlier generations learned under conditions they should never have had to endure. That was the burden and the gift at the same time. The burden was knowing how much had been lost, how much had been denied, and how often Black families had been forced to fight for things other Americans were simply allowed to expect. The gift was that even through all of that, wisdom still survived. It survived in family habits. It survived in warnings. It survived in expectations. It survived in the voices of elders who may not have used the language of policy or history books, but understood the world well enough to prepare their children for it. That is why these commandments still matter now. Not because the world is exactly the same, but because the need to recognize danger, protect knowledge, and tell the truth has never disappeared. A different generation may face different forms of pressure, but pressure is still pressure. Silence is still silence. And confusion is still one of the easiest ways to control people. That is why learning remains sacred. That is why memory remains necessary. That is why storytelling remains part of survival. Because if you understand what your people lived through, you can recognize more clearly what you are living through now. And maybe that is one of the deepest lessons of all. The commandments were never just about getting through one hard time. They were about handing the next generation enough understanding to walk through the next one with their eyes open. Walking with their eyes open mattered. Every generation faced its own version of the same question: what do we hold on to, and what do we pass forward? For Black families, that answer was rarely simple. Some passed down land, some passed down church, some passed down stories, songs, recipes, names, warnings, and ways of reading the room before danger ever fully revealed itself. Many passed down education, not as a luxury, but as a lifeline. That is why a child sitting at a kitchen table with homework in front of them was never just a child doing homework. That child was standing inside generations of effort, inside prayers, inside sacrifice, inside unfinished dreams. A mother checking spelling words after a long day of work was not only helping with a lesson, she was protecting the future. A father asking whether homework was finished was not only being strict, he was trying to make sure the next generation would not walk blindfolded into the same traps. Even when families disagreed, even when pressure felt heavy, even when children did not yet understand why the expectations were so high, the deeper purpose remained the same. Stay alert. Keep learning. Do not surrender your mind. Once people lose the ability to name what is happening to them, they become easier to control. That is why these commandments still speak across time. Not because they promise an easy life, but because they offer a way to move through a hard one with more clarity, more protection, and more understanding than the generations before were allowed to have. That in itself is a kind of inheritance. The deeper truth is that none of these commandments stood alone. Learning to read led to teaching another. Teaching another led to telling the story truthfully. Telling the story truthfully helped families recognize danger, protect. The deeper truth is that none of these commandments stood alone. Learning to read led to teaching another. Teaching another led to telling the story truthfully. Telling the story truthfully helped families recognize danger, protect one another, and keep the next generation from walking blind into the same traps. That is why these lessons were never only about individual success. They were about collective survival. One child learning to read could help a whole family understand a contract. One elder telling the truth about what happened in Mississippi could help a younger generation make sense of Chicago. One parent pushing education could alter the direction of children not yet old enough to understand what was being carried for them. That is how survival moved, not only through strength, but through transfer, through memory, through discipline, through language, through the refusal to let hard-earned wisdom disappear. And maybe that is what makes these commandments so powerful even now. They remind us that survival was never random. It was taught. It was protected. It was repeated until it became culture. That is why these stories still matter. Not just so we can admire what earlier generations endured, but so we can understand what they were trying to hand us: clarity, awareness, direction, and a chance to walk a little farther than they did. What you heard tonight was only the first commandment: learn to read, teach another, but it never stood alone. It lived beside the others. Tell the story truthfully. Protect family. Stand together. Claim freedom fully. That is why these stories still matter. They are not just about the past. They are about what was handed to us and what we are meant to carry forward. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to From Chains to Change. Drop a comment and tell me which commandment you think we still need the most today. And tell me where you're watching from.